All right. Hello, everyone out there. I am Gregory Tall from the Gregory Tall Company, and we design and facilitate interactive workshops to help people become better communicators in the workplace. I appreciate you tuning in for today's session. And as you probably already know, it's all about the future of DEI. And as you're listening and watching right now, I have a question for you. Have you heard anything about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the last week, 2 weeks, last month? I'm guessing you're probably nodding yes, emphatically yes. I've heard a lot, I've read a lot, I've been doom scrolling, and there's so much out there, and I'm not sure how to make sense of everything. So today's conversation is for folks inside organizations that are working on their DEI goals and initiatives, and maybe you're feeling a little bit off balance, you're feeling a little bit lost right now about how to move forward given everything that's happening right now in the world, in the U.S., and so I'm hoping today that I will give you some tools that will make sense of where we are right now, that will give you some predictions about where I think we might be going, and then also give you some takeaways for things you can be doing inside your organization right now to stay true to your values of inclusion. Now, today's session is organized around the theme of headlines because I'm guessing, again, that you've been reading lots of headlines in the past couple of weeks. Again, maybe some doom scrolling there. And so I'm going to share with you some headlines you probably already heard, but also 3 big headlines from my perspective, again, about where we are, where we're going, and what we can do going forward. And the thing I need to mention here as a disclaimer is that I am not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice. And I'm mentioning that because, of course, much of what's happening right now in the DEI space relates to executive orders that have come out, memos from the Department of Justice. So we're entering a phase now more than ever where the matter of DEI has become a legal issue. And so one of the reasons you might be feeling some concern right now is because you're trying to navigate this in a way where you're holding true to your organizational values, but you're also trying to make sure you're mitigating risk on behalf of your organization. So I just want to make sure you're aware that I want you to listen in today, take from this what you can, but please do consult with your general counsel inside your organization. Get legal support before you do anything, make any moves. Just make sure you really understand, make sure the organization is protected as you're going along. So with that, here is my first headline for you all, and this one will probably come as no surprise at all. But the big headline for me is DEI, in other words, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is under significant attack. I say it's under significant attack because I think that when we really digest what's happening right now, more than ever, there's a very prolific, very proactive, very bold attack on DEI. There is no attempt to mince words right now of the current administration. There is no attempt to water it down. It's been very clear from day one, since Inauguration Day, that the goal of the current administration is to entirely dismantle any and all forms of DEI. So I want to again give you some sense of what's happened just really since like late last year, maybe this year, early in the year 2025. Of course, the story goes back long before that, but I think that much of what you might be thinking about right now really relates to things that have happened fairly recently. So let me give you a rundown of where we are. In January, shortly after inauguration, this executive order came out, and it's called the Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity. And this was an executive order that essentially really was kind of one of the first moves to start to dismantle DEI as a whole. Now, I'm going to just kind of pull in just a small snippet of the text from that particular executive order. I will share the link to the full text as well if you're interested in looking through and reading that. But one of the big things I want to kind of pull out of here is this executive order really spoke to executive departments inside the government, inside the federal government more specifically, to end all discriminatory and illegal preferences primarily. And what they're talking about here is what we would call everything under the umbrella of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, the executive order itself is fairly long and detailed, but very specifically, what seems to be very much highlighted here is really talking about specifically race and gender. So if you read through the entire executive order, you'll see that those two areas, those two diversity dimensions in particular, are really referenced quite frequently in the course of the executive order. And this was a really big deal. Lots of people paid attention to this. I'm sure you heard about it, and it got a lot of coverage in the news. But that was one of the first things that happened. But then something happened shortly thereafter that really made a significant splash in the workplace across organizations across the entire United States. And that was in early February when the incoming Attorney General comes in. The Department of Justice makes a big announcement. They're going to be now investigating companies that engage in DEI. And this was the thing that really sent shockwaves throughout the workplace, because the prior executive order, while certainly a very clear and straightforward attempt to dismantle DEI, this was really different in the sense that it's really called out private employers, right? Private workplaces, and saying that we are going to investigate you. We are going to try to eliminate the programs. We will penalize anyone involved in, DEI or DEIA in this case, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And again, the big thing here is it really was targeting private sector employers, which is something that we've really not seen in this capacity previously. And this has really already started. So fairly recently after that, we see that the FCC announces they're going to be investigating Comcast DEI programs. And if you're watching this again from your organization, you might be thinking, this makes me and us very nervous. We are a private workplace. We have a long history and legacy of commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And now what we're seeing is out of the Fed that this essentially has been deemed illegal and could be subject to litigation action from the federal government. So that's the space we're in right now, and that is very scary. Understandably, that is leaving a lot of companies feeling that they're not sure what to do and how to move forward. And that's part of the reason why I created today's session, because in my work, I had several clients asking me this exact question, which is, what can we do right now? So I mentioned I want to give you a little bit of hope as well as we're going along today. And make no mistakes about it, we're in a very challenging, a very hard time. So I'm not making light of anything that's happening. But I do want to make sure that we recognize that the headlines we're seeing all the time can really create this sense of doom, that there's really nothing good at all happening. So I want to highlight, if you will, kind of the entire picture, some things you might not have seen as much of, or might not be aware of, that will hopefully give you just a little bit of reassurance as we get into this next phase of the session. So my second big headline is, the reports of DEI's death are greatly exaggerated. And I get it. I know that as you are watching this right now, again, you've been doom scrolling. You've seen all the stuff out there, and it seems like every other day, no, every other hour, there's a new news report out about the most recent large employer, the most recent large organization that has said we're stepping back from our DEI activities, or we're discontinuing entirely our DEI activities. And again, it feels this very overwhelming. But I want you to also know there are some things happening that I think give some really good promise as to the reality that DEI is not by any means going through a quick and immediate death. I think there are lots of organizations that are still very much committed to DEI as part of their values, and we're going to see that play out in different ways based on the organization, and I would say kind of their level of risk that might be involved. But I want to highlight a few that I think you'll find very interesting. So first, it's going to take us back to late last year, and you've probably heard about Costco already. Maybe you've gone by there to get a $1.50 hot dog. Maybe by the time this recording comes out, that hot dog might cost a little bit more. But for now, I think it's still $1.50. And what happened here was there was a push by an activist group of shareholders. And what they really said was to Costco, they wanted Costco to essentially abandon and dismantle their DEI practices. Now, the reassuring thing here was immediately and very publicly and very straightforwardly, the Costco board said, absolutely not. And they were very strong, very straightforward and confident in their language, talking about the value of diversity and inclusion to the business, the value to the culture there, the value when it comes to their vendor relationships, just really going in and really identifying all the ways that DEI has been positively impactful to their business in so many ways, and essentially said we're not going to back down on this. So this kind of plays out, and the shareholder meeting eventually comes around. And what happened, if you did not hear this news story, was overwhelmingly, when the shareholder vote came in, overwhelmingly they rejected the anti-DEI proposal. And I mean, the margin was not even close. Over 90% of Costco shareholders voted and said, let's keep DEI in motion. Let's keep on doing this. So I think this is a very reassuring sign that despite the headlines you might be hearing every day, the news clips, there are organizations that are holding steady in their commitment to inclusion, but also they're being successful, and they're seeing that their stakeholders actually very much want to continue down that path of inclusion as well. Another big organization you might have heard of, one of my favorites, of course, is Apple. And similarly to Costco, there was a group of shareholders who started to urge Apple to discontinue their DEI policies. And similar to Costco, Apple said, nope, we see value for this in our business. We are going to keep on going. And I think that these two organizations in particular, Costco and Apple, they're not the only two that have taken this stance that has been very strong. We have others like Elf Cosmetics, Delta Airlines that have really said and kind of say, we're committed to our inclusion practices. I think these in particular, though, are really significant for a couple of reasons. So one, when we think about Costco, we think about Apple. These are very large, publicly traded companies that, if I were to make a guess, these are the kinds of organizations that would be the subject. They would be the target, if you will, no pun intended there, of any kind of litigation from the feds, right? These are companies that have, very big brands, and, bringing litigation against them is going to make for really big headlines. And I think that's part of what is looking to be accomplished in some of what we're seeing right now. But the other reason it's reassuring is these companies are companies that are extremely profitable, and they've been consistently profitable. So for any narrative out there that says that DEI is actually hurting business or is putting, unqualified people in place and it's leading to bad decisions, Apple and Costco are organizations that have a very long history of solid financial performance, very long history of increasing shareholder value. So these are things that really underscore the business value of inclusion. And the other part of this is these are organizations that if there is litigation, these are organizations that have lots of resources to really engage in holding their position. So we think about Apple, lots of financial resources to engage in litigation, but also very experienced in kind of going down that path. So The good thing in that sense is that if we do see cases start to arise against organizations like Costco and Apple that have resources, their victories there, I think, really have a positive effect on other organizations as well if we see victories in court cases there. So we'll keep an eye on what's happening in that space. But again, those are very positive signs. Now, those are a couple of things that I think are fairly recently unfolding stories, but there are some organizations that for a very long time have been very steadfast and very public in their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of those organizations is Ben and Jerry's, and if you were to go to their website and you go right to their main page, you'll see it at the top there. It's activism, and they don't hide this in any way. It's right there on their main landing page. You'll see activism. When you click that, you're going to then be led to issues that we care about, and they call out very specifically issues that we're fully committed to and behind in a very clear, straightforward, unapologetic way. So some of the things they have that you can find on their website right now is their commitment to racial justice, their support of the LGBTQ community as well. You will also find they are very clear in their recognition of the impact of climate change and their support for climate justice initiatives. And when we think about kind of the things that are really like front and center right now that are in the news, that are these very complicated, polarizing issues. Of course, one of the big ones that comes to mind right now in the United States is the issue of immigration. And even on this one, we see Ben and Jerry's really out front and saying very publicly, right, that they support the rights and dignity of refugees and asylum seekers. So the point I'm making here is certainly these might not be views that are certainly universally popular right now, but they've stood behind their values and they've stood behind them very publicly. And we're not hearing Ben and Jerry's going out of business anytime soon. It seems like they're doing very well. And so what I'm getting at is, as we think about our own organizations, it can feel very daunting in the current landscape to feel like we're staying where we are. We're going to stay committed to our inclusion, goals. But we worry also about, the risk it might pose when it comes to litigation, when it comes to public scrutiny. And we see here, again, these are just a handful of examples of companies that are staying the course and are seeing positive results and are not seeing their untimely and immediate demise. So hopefully these things are reassuring. And the other thing I want to add here, we think of as kind of some reassurance, is that even for, if you will, kind of the group, kind of the opponents of diversity, equity, inclusion, they're largely acknowledging that we have a long way to go before it's dismantled. So, for example, if you were to visit the website of the Heritage Foundation, this is a conservative, right-leaning think tank, and you'd find they have this whole report essentially where they talk about why DEI should be dismantled. But even in their own report, they acknowledge here that if you take a look at the Fortune 500 right now, 486 out of the 500 companies in the Fortune 500, if you go to their websites right now, current time, you will still find some kind of statement talking about their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So again, even those who are opponents of DEI are acknowledging that largely the number of companies that have abandoned ship is fairly small in the grand scheme of things. So again, hopefully that is reassuring in some way to you. And those are, if you will, kind of the macro environment things that are happening. And if I may, I'd like to take some time to talk about what's happening in my own world. So my company, the Gregory Tall Company, is not the size, obviously, of Apple or Costco or Ben & Jerry's, any of those companies. But I do have the chance in my work to work with literally dozens of clients every single year across industries. So everything from telecom to financial services to healthcare to ad agencies to manufacturers to not-for-profits to associations. And I want to spend just a moment here and talk about what I am seeing and experiencing in my own business and kind of what's been happening for me. And what I've seen is that largely, it does not appear, from my perspective, that companies are entirely abandoning their DEI efforts. What I am seeing, though, is I'm certainly seeing, I'd say, a little bit more of a rebranding effort. And I can think about organizations that I'm working with that are this year in 2025 doing their first ever DEI program ever. They're coming on board for the first time right now in the aftermath of the executive order that I mentioned earlier. I've got some clients I've been working with for a number of years that are continuing right on with their journey, and they're still doing their same trainings and workshops. They're bringing their frontline employees along. They're bringing their managers, their leadership teams along, and even with everything that's going on, they are fully committed and on board. And I've got some that are doing something just a little bit different. So they're still on board. They're still moving forward. However, they're doing so with a certain degree of caution. And here's what I mean. Particularly those that might have government contracts or things like that, they're making sure that in terms of their verbiage, how they're publicizing programs, how they're positioning them internally, they're making sure they're not doing anything that might open them up to, again, any kind of, outside litigation. And some people might say, well, that's kind of taking a step back, right? And I don't necessarily think of it that way solely. What I'm thinking about their perspective is, from my conversations with them, is they're saying, look, these are things we have been doing, we're very committed to, and now there are outside stakeholders that would attempt to disrupt that, and we have limited resources, and we would spend our time and our resources doing the work, not explaining and justifying to outside parties, why we're doing the work. So I think the choice here is not so much about abandoning and kind of taking the shortcut, but more so it's really about, if we can, let's not get into a long drawn out battle about, the verbiage we're using or defending what we know to be valuable to our business. Let's make the adjustments now and keep our work going forward. So what has happened is, for some clients, for every client that I work with, whenever we have a workshop before the event, we have a pre-event call. And that event call is essentially my time to meet with the person who's bringing me in for the training, to talk about, who's going to be participating, what are their goals for the training, go through all the logistics. And so the thing that's changed is, for some clients now, they are inviting to that meeting their general counsel. And the purpose simply is they want to make sure that, their legal person has a chance to hear what's in the training, maybe get a chance to see any other materials, just make sure that they feel good about everything. And by and large, it has gone just fine every single time right now. It's kind of an extra step that I'm seeing some clients taking. So again, I want to reiterate, I'm not saying that clients are abandoning ship. I'm saying they're adjusting their approach and thinking more intentionally about how they are positioning things. And perhaps as you're listening right now, you are doing the exact same thing. You're staying on course in your organization, but thinking about how do we make sure we position it in a way that we're being true to our values. However, also recognizing there is a higher level of risk involved now than there was a couple months ago. So I hope that is at least a little bit reassuring. And that's not to say there has not been a reduction at all in DEI training. But what I'm saying is, it's not been solely and entirely in response to the most recent executive, memo that came out. And even in January, after this memo came out, one of the clients I work with booked 20 days of my most recent, inclusion workshop. So again, I'm seeing clients that are still not just kind of quietly doing things, but some are still pretty aggressively investing in, their inclusion. So, and hopefully that is reassuring for you and gives you some peace of mind as you're thinking about where your organization is going next. And that brings me to my third and final headline, and that is that the future, at least what I'm thinking right now, is all about inclusion. The future is all about inclusion. And here's what I mean. So, how I mentioned just a moment ago, I think a lot of organizations are simply rebranding how they approach DEI. Well, I think the word inclusion really kind of wraps in all parts of DEI, if you really think about it. So if you think about inclusion, an inclusive space is one that is diverse. An inclusive space is one where we have people that have diverse kinds of work experience and diverse kinds of lived and life experiences. That is what inclusion means. Inclusion means that when we get people inside our organization, that we are finding ways to make sure they're seen, they're heard, they're appreciated, they have their contributions valued in the same way as their peers. That is what inclusion means. We think about what inclusion means. It means equity as well. It means that for every single person inside our organization, that they're going to have equitable access to the resources they need to thrive and contribute and do their best work and contribute to the success of the organization. So they're going to have equitable access to professional development, access to mobility opportunities, access to visibility. So kind of all the things that we talk about our DEI, I think really are captured in inclusion. And so my guess is that many of you might be rebranding right now and really focusing your efforts around inclusion. So again, it's really taking everything into account, but in terms of the verbiage you might be using, right now might be all about inclusion. And if I were to make my guess, that is the direction I'm going to say a lot of organizations will be going forward with. And even last year, the Society for Human Resources Management, the world's largest HR professional association, rebranded, their DEI efforts. So they went from DEI to D&I, so diversity and inclusion. So we've seen this evolution over time, and I think again that organizations are simply thinking about how do we keep on doing what we're doing, but minimizing the risk of scrutiny that's going to distract from our overall work. The last thing, that was the third headline. So now I want to give you, if you will, kind of 4 action items. And what I'll say about DEI today is the same thing I've always said about it, and that is that if we don't do anything, nothing happens. So we can attend, seminars and sessions, go through training. We can read stuff. We can listen to podcasts. We can, have these cathartic moments with our people in our network. But we have to ultimately decide that we're going to do something. So I want to give you 4 things that you can do inside your organization. And my suggestion would be to you, if these sound appealing and you have the conversation internally and you feel good about it, to do all 4 of them. If you can't do all 4, then do 3. If you can't do 3, then do 2. If you can't do 2, start with 1. Do not ever underestimate the importance and significance of even a single action as a catalyst for future development and future progress. So here's the first thing. I would like for you to, if you've not already done it, to get clear and consistent with your internal messaging around inclusion. And there's a couple things I'm really getting at with this. So if you're watching this right now, my presumption is that as an HR leader inside your organization, as a manager, as a senior leader, you are in a place where you want to continue on fulfilling your organization's commitment to inclusion, but you're feeling some uncertainty. You're feeling a little bit stressed about what that should look like going forward. And I bring that up because if you are watching this right now as a leader inside your organization and feeling that sense of uncertainty, feeling that sense of stress, then all the more I think it's going to be felt by the people throughout your organization. I'm talking about your individual contributors, people on the front lines, people doing the work day in, day out. I'm talking about your managers. They are feeling it too. So what's really important here is that you get out there with a message. And I think there's 2 things that are really important. First is the education piece. And so I think it's fair to say, mathematically speaking, that even if you have as few as 10 people inside your organization, there's probably a chance that someone who is there feels the exact opposite of what I'm saying right now, meaning they would say, I don't see the value in inclusion. I actually do think we should remove and dismantle DEI from every organization. So I want to give you a little bit of just kind of insight around how to acknowledge that reality. And I think a very respectful, but a very straightforward way that kind of upholds the position of your organization and your values. And one of the things that really comes to mind for me that's striking is, again, referring to that executive order that came out. Many times when the conversation around DEI is had, it really focuses around, at least from the opponents of DEI, this idea that there's this big group of women and people of color who are unqualified for jobs, and they're getting hired into those jobs because of their gender and or race. And of course, that narrative is entirely untrue, but that is a narrative that gets put out there so frequently. And so it presents this very limiting view of inclusion. And for people who might not be part of an underrepresented group in that way, in that context, either by their gender or race, it might feel like, well, this doesn't really apply to me. And it feels even like, this inclusion thing actually is going to, hurt me. It is going to, limit my opportunities or my access. So The important thing in terms of internal messaging is to make sure people have a really realistic sense of how far and wide inclusion is. So inclusion is not just hiring people. Inclusion means that for people who have a visible or invisible disability, we have a workplace where we provide reasonable accommodation so people can come in and perform their work. That is part of inclusion. Inclusion is leave policies that acknowledge our humanity. It is that if my personal health is suffering, I need to take time away from work. There's a leave policy that covers me in that sense. It means that if my child's health is, suffering in some way, I need to take leave time for that. There's coverage there. If it's my adopted child, my stepchild, there's coverage in that sense. If it's my partner, same sex or opposite sex partner, then there's a leave policy that protects me to, again, fulfill my obligations as a human being, as part of my family. And again, these are things that apply across the board to everyone. Inclusion means, as we think about culturally, that we have different communication norms. So maybe people come from a culture where they tend to have more deference for authority figures, people who have, big job titles, and they're less likely to speak up in situations where they have to present a view that opposes that of someone in a leadership role. Inclusion means we find a way to make sure we're not missing out on those insights. We're not missing out on those ideas. We're not missing out on those contributions because, again, part of the value of that is that those different perspectives, those different views are important to us making good decisions. They're important to us solving problems. They're important to us innovating. So that's part of it too. Inclusion is thinking about we have lots of introverts among us. And I would argue that for a lot of organizations, the culture internally in terms of meetings tends to be a lot more oriented towards those that are extroverted. So it's making sure we create space and inclusion for people who are introverted to contribute, to be heard in the same way. So these are just a few examples I'm giving you right now. But what I'm getting at is that inclusion is not just about race and gender in hiring. It certainly does include how we bring talent into our organizations, but it includes thinking about the experiences people have inside the organization. It includes the culture. It includes making sure people have comfortable, safe work environments. It really gets down to how do we make sure that every single person has a chance to contribute their absolute best and do their best work here. And I would say there's no organization that would not want to get people doing their absolute best work. So that's the first part of internal messaging. The second part of internal messaging is to reassure people inside your organization that if you are behind and committed to ongoing, your ongoing values of inclusion, that you verbalize that. Because externally, you might not be making big statements, and it's fine if you're not. You might be starting to remove certain, language from your website, but you want to make sure that people who are showing up every single day know exactly where you stand. So again, if you've not done it already, get your people together, make sure they know that, inclusion is one of our core values. It always has been. It always will be. Things might sound different in terms of the language you use for the forthcoming, weeks, months, maybe even years. But in terms of what we want to accomplish, in terms of our commitment to having a truly inclusive culture, that remains unchanged. So make sure that message is not taken for granted, that people understand that. So really big thing there. All right, here is the second thing. There it is right now, people. I want you to provide inclusion training for all your people leaders. Now, I know what you're thinking to yourself right now. Self, this is a little bit of a sales pitch, isn't it? Isn't Greg's company, don't they do management training? And the answer is, yes, we do. And I would love if you engage the Gregory Tall Company to train your managers. But here's what I'm telling you for real. Even if you don't work with Gregory Tall Company, please, I implore you, make sure you're giving your people managers the resources to show up consistently as inclusive leaders, as folks that are trained, they're equipped to get the absolute best out of everyone in your workforce. So again, we're not strictly talking about race and gender here. We are including that, but we're talking about people based on different ages, different lived experiences, people who come from different parts of the country, folks who serve in the military, folks who've not, people who have visible and invisible disabilities. We're talking about people who are neurodivergent. So I'm talking about kind of all the ways that we're different, we want to make sure we have managers that are equipped to serve people, to serve the wide array of folks you have inside your organization. And we know for a fact that managers want this training. So many managers right now are people who were doing an excellent job as individual contributors, and then along comes someone and says, you know what, you're doing a great job, and now I'm going to give you this team to lead. And the sentiment, and I think the idea behind that is fantastic, but many times we're putting people in a role they might not feel entirely equipped to manage. So now, more than ever, I would say it's always been important to make sure your managers are well versed at showing up as inclusive leaders that create opportunities for people to have access, again, to professional development, to mobility, to visibility. But now, more than ever, your managers have to be able to do that. And I want to be clear, I don't want this to feel like it's something extra that your people leaders have to be doing. I want it to be something when they think about inclusion as being embedded in everything they do. Every conversation, every interaction, every decision is always filtered through the lens of inclusion. It's how we live, it's how we breathe, it's what we do. So again, make sure you're taking the time to equip your managers with training on how to consistently show up as inclusive leaders. All right, number 3. I want to encourage you to review and revise as needed any policies or practices. And the reason for this one is because, again, we're in the space now where DEI and activities under the umbrella of DEI are being deemed to be illegal, which means you could be subject to litigation. And so it simply requires you to go back and take a look at existing policies and just make sure there's nothing written in handbooks on your website, any place else that unknowingly might leave you a little bit more vulnerable to litigation. And this has evolved and still evolving over time, but I want to kind of give you just 3 examples here of something that was, never, good to have out there, something that has kind of shifted, and something I think puts you in a pretty good place. So let's start this one. If you say this, we are committed to hiring a Black person for this job, make sure that you have an attorney on retainer because you're going to need that person. And this is not brand new illegal. People, this has been illegal always. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has always said you cannot hire people on the basis of race. Even if you have a client of your organization that says, we would really prefer to work with someone of this particular race, even still, you cannot do it. So this is nothing brand new. And if you are doing this where you're saying, we want to hire a person of a certain ethnicity or race or color, don't do it, right? And this kind of goes back to this false narrative that diverse candidate automatically also means unqualified. And when we talk about, diverse candidates, what we're getting at is we're choosing people who are highly, highly qualified and also happen to be part of an underrepresented group. But this would be something that we never want to do. So let me give you another example here. What about this one? Our goal is to increase representation of Black people inside our company. Now, this is an example of a position or a statement that prior to the last 2 months largely would have been just fine. This is where a lot of you had DEI goals laid out in your plans, in your ESG statements, things like that, where you said, we want to increase representation. And when we go back to like the 2020, kind of the big push following the murder of George Floyd, we see lots of organizations being very specific saying, we want to increase representation. And this is actually a slide from a presentation I did back in, I say, like maybe 2022, talking about ways we could break the needle when it came to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in that time and space, we saw lots of companies saying very straightforwardly, here is our goal for increasing representation for underrepresented groups. So what I'm getting at again is, in the past, those things would have been just fine. And to be clear, I think they're still just fine and very important goals. The difference now is those same statements will subject your organization to a lot more scrutiny and potentially, again, litigation. I think that when we consider what kind of stuff agencies will be looking for in terms of enforcement. It'll be statements like that where it says we're looking to increase representation of this particular group. I think that's the stuff they're going to say is really evidence of discriminatory behavior. So that's the kind of stuff I want you to go back, pay attention to, make sure that if it's in any place in any of your materials internally, if you're okay with it, just recognize that that is now a new level of risk that probably did not exist before. And if you feel like, it creates more risk and, potential, exposure for us and we're comfortable with, then now's the time to go back and revisit some of those things. The last example I'll give you is this one. We are expanding our campus recruitment efforts to include HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities. And I think this is an example of something that even in the current context, post-executive order, post-Department of Justice memo, I think this one is still just fine. This is not saying we have a preference for it. It's not saying we're excluding anyone. It's not saying we're only going to. It's saying we're expanding our reach to include, and there's that word again, inclusion. We're including HBCUs. So that's why I said earlier, I think that going forward, the big key is going to come all down to this idea of inclusion. How do we position things to reflect that we're looking to make sure we're opening up more opportunities, we're not discriminating in any way, and that's what inclusion really comes down to. So those are your 4 action items, and again, I'd say, actually, I lied. That's only the first 3. I've got one more for you coming up here, and I actually want to tell you a story to kind of lead into it. Now, late last year in 2024, you might have saw this headline as well, and this headline was the CEO of ExxonMobil said that the United States should remain in the Paris Climate Accord. Now, you might again be thinking to yourself again right here, how in the world do we end up with having the CEO of a fossil fuel company, no less, saying, hey, we should stay in the Paris Climate Accord? By the way, spoiler alert, we didn't. We got out of it. Okay, but here's what was going on. It was not about this stance on climate justice or anything like that. That's not at all what it was about. Here's what ExxonMobil was saying. They were saying that this is creating this back and forth about, the climate pact, instability and unpredictability and uncertainty in our business, and that causes issues. What they were saying was, okay, so Obama administration, we're into the Paris Climate Accord. Okay, not loving it, but we're in. Great. Then we have Trump administration, and we're back out. Then we have the Biden administration, and then we're back in. And now we have the next Trump administration, and now we're back out. So what ExxonMobil was saying was that all this gyration up and down, it's making it hard for the business. And so that gets to my 4th and final point, and that is I want you to stay committed to your inclusion goals. It is very tempting right now to back off. It's very tempting to change course and say, let's not do that anymore. But I want to take a moment to remind you why you did it in the first place and the results you seen to be true. The reason you spent so much time and invested so much time and effort in it is you've seen it has real, tangible results for the business. You've seen that you are more productive, more profitable, more innovative, faster, smarter, solving problems at a better pace when you held true to your inclusion standards. You didn't just do it because you said this has been working really well for the business, and you spent time to train managers. You spent time to build culture. You spent time to go back and rework processes and make sure again that you really have an inclusive workplace. And so now, one of the worst things you can do is start to undo all that work you've been doing, and then have to maybe redo it again in a fairly short amount of time. So again, it feels daunting right now. I get that, but I think that the best path is to stay on the path you're on. Stick with the investment that you said. We know this investment is worthwhile. We've seen the return on investment, and we're going to stay committed to that. What I'll also say about this idea of staying on track is one of the reasons that these changes that we're experiencing right now have come so quickly is because They are executive orders, which can and have been signed as soon as the new administration comes in and put into place. Well, by that same token, that means they can be reversed just as quickly. So, as we think about where we are right now, things is happening very rapidly, but they can unhappen, if you will, just as rapidly. Now, probably will not happen under this administration, but can happen in the future. So, what I'm getting at here is that things are challenging right now, but these are things that are not things we've seen become, if you will, the rule of law, by meaning they have, gone through Congress and been signed by the president. We're not talking about things that are codified into law. These are executive orders that can be undone by subsequent administrations. So want to make sure you're aware of that. And the last thing I'll mention here about, kind of this idea of headlines and the doom scrolling is this reality. And that is that, remember, at the end of the day, that news is news. And by that I'm saying the stuff you're seeing in your news feeds and social media is stuff that is positioned there because it is making news. And to give you an example, you never hear a news story about the car accident that does not happen. You never hear a news story about the house does not get robbed. You never hear a news story about the carjacking that does not occur. But you hear everyone about the time that it does. And it's not to diminish the impact of those times. What I'm getting at here is we all know that more frequently those things are not happening than they are. But the news occurs when they do happen. So in the same thing now, I mentioned earlier, most of the Fortune 500 are still in with their DEI commitments, at least again, as far as their websites are concerned and what they're stating publicly. And we've seen a handful of companies that have publicly come out and made adjustments. But overall, we're not going to see a news story too frequently saying, hey, this company is just staying on board with their DEI, unless we see something like with Costco or Apple, there's a big, an activist shareholder motion, and that creates some news around that. But otherwise, it's probably not going to make the news. So what I'm saying is just take with a grain of salt what you're seeing and make sure you recognize that what we're seeing every single day is not representative necessarily of everything that's out there. All right, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up right here, right now. I hope you found this to be very helpful. I will include the links below to the resources I mentioned. So I will include the links to check out that executive order, that DOJ memo, if you want to read that for yourself. And I will go ahead and flash up my information here. So if you have additional thoughts, questions you want to share, here's my website. There's my email address as well. And of course, if your organization is looking for a partner in your inclusion training or your management training, or for that matter, any part of your communication skills training, I'd love to have a conversation with you. Thank you all so much for watching today. Please take care, and I'll see you again soon.